I want to thank you for making your way over to our session here. I don't know how you're all feeling, but I'm feeling a little bit these days like we're on this sort of endless roller coaster ride. We got some incredible highs and some really not so fun lows. Simple things like baking bread brings great joy. I don't know if everybody else has gotten into that, but then we're also cut off from our families during times of loss, which has been really challenging. And on the political front, you have, Trump. Like, what else more do you need to say? Like, the truly corrosive politics of Trump contrasted by what has been record-breaking turnout in elections, not just in the US, but around the world, in places like Sri Lanka, South Korea. Even New Brunswick saw some of the highest voter turnout despite holding an election in the middle of a pandemic. So I hope today's session provides more highs than lows. Okay, looks like most people have joined us. My name is John Beebe, and I lead the Democratic Engagement Exchange in the Faculty of Arts at Ryerson University. And I'm joined today by my colleagues, Professor Michael McGregor, and I believe Taylor Deasley is helping to moderate in the feed loop and get your questions to us. Our mission at the Democratic Engagement Exchange is simple: build a vibrant and inclusive democracy in Canada. This session is presented in partnership with the Ryerson Faculty of Arts and is part of the Canadian Vote Summit, which brings together leading scholars, innovative community-based organizations, and dedicated public servants, all who share a commitment to building a vibrant democracy in Canada. The summit concludes next week with the keynote presentations by Elections Canada CEO Stéphane Perreault, who will be speaking publicly for the first time since before the last federal election, and Andre Blais, who literally wrote the book on the motivation to vote. So we hope that you'll be able to join us then, and that's part of the Democracy Festival session. If you're interested in learning more about our work and you have not already, please visit our website, engagedemocracy.ca, and follow us at RUEngageX. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be distributed after Democracy Exchange to participants. Only the speakers will be visible in the video, so all of you folks attending, where you're not going to be on camera. We welcome your engagement in this conversation. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen that you can use to send questions to the speakers. We will do our best to address the questions with the time allotted. And there's also a chat box on the right, which allows you to interact with other summit participants. Our chat moderator, Taylor, will help provide helpful links and additional content throughout the session. If you need any help throughout the summit, please contact summit@democracyexchange.org or visit the help desk located in the festival tab. Today's session will begin with very brief opening remarks by our presenters, followed by a moderated conversation, and then we'll open up to Q&A from you. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Professor McGregor to introduce our presenters.
Thanks, John. Thanks for everybody for attending, to all our presenters, to our RAs. We've got a couple RAs in the audience here. Thanks to all of you. It takes a lot of work to set up this series. So as John said, this is part of the Democracy Exchange, but it's also part of another speaker series called the Canadian Vote Summit, which is run through John's Democratic Engagement Exchange. And the purpose of that summit is to bring together people from different silos, like people who are interested in voter turnout, but they're in different fields who might not interact with one another a lot, and who maybe have things that they've done or learned that they maybe can pass on to people in the other silos. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to, I don't know, mix the silos. I don't know where to take that metaphor. But past sessions in this series have included topics such as nonpartisan voter education, voter turnout initiatives, how to target youths and new Canadians in particular, and all the videos for those are available through the Democratic Engagement Exchange, I think on Facebook. Today we're talking about lessons from the front lines of democracy and how to run an inclusive voter engagement campaign. Now, among academics, voter turnout is one of the most studied topics in the field. Among practitioners, convincing electors and often a particular group of electors to convert from non-voters to voters is a task that is basically as old as elections themselves. We know, however, that voter turnout patterns are uneven. Some types of electors are simply more likely to vote than others, and sometimes it's much more likely. And these participation gaps have implications for the quality of representation and even basic ideas of fairness. So they matter. Now, all of our speakers today are aware of these gaps, and they've done work where they've recognized them and taken steps to either understand them or close them. So we have a wonderful set of speakers today. To start, we have Semra Sevi, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Montreal, where she studies elections, turnout voting systems, and the behavior of political representatives in Canada. She has a BA and an MA from the U of T. Semra's going to talk today about some research she's conducted for Elections Canada on perceptions of how easy or difficult the act of voting is and how this can affect the decision of whether to vote or not. Using data from the 2019 federal election, she's going to discuss whether some Canadians choose to abstain because of this burden or perceived burden that the act of voting places upon them. Thanks for joining today, Semra.
Should I start, or are you going to introduce the other speakers? No? Okay. Okay, well, thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen. 1 second. And how do I do slideshow? Okay, great. I'll just put that Zoom away. Okay, so thank you very much for having me. I'm presenting today a joint project with Andre Blais. It's a report we wrote for Elections Canada on the burden of voting in the 2019 Canadian federal election. So we embarked on this project because we want voting to be as easy as possible, because we want turnout to be as high as possible. And the reason for this is because turnout contributes to the quality of democracy, and it's often considered to be a crucial criteria for democratic performance. So, oh, I don't know why. Oh. Okay, so the research questions that we have is, do Canadians find it easy to vote? And is the burden of voting higher for some Canadians than for others? The data that we use comes from the National Elector Studies, which is conducted by Elections Canada. This is a panel survey that's conducted by telephone or online to Canadian citizens who are at least 18 years of age on election day. It's a longitudinal survey, so we have data that was collected during the election campaign and during the election itself and after the election. And we have a huge sample size, which is representative based on age, gender, and province. So throughout this study, we focus on 4 specific burdens that citizens may face if they wish to vote. These are burdens associated with registering to vote, going to the polling station, and then once you're at the polling station, to actually cast your ballot, and finally, the decision process of who to vote for. So I'm going to show some figures for you, and in each of them, I will talk about how big and small these burdens are perceived to be. And because of limited time, I'll just focus on the main takeaways from these figures. So for each of these possible burdens that I just discussed with you, the most frequent response is very easy. Canadians find that each of the burdens to be very minimal. The percentage of very easy is over 90% for registration, about 70% for going to the polling station, and about 40% for deciding who to vote for. It's also about 70% for voting once you're at the polling station. So from this figure itself, we can conclude that a great majority of Canadians perceive voting to be quite easy. There are, however, other questions that allow us to better understand why voting is construed to be easy, especially with respect to going to the polling station and then casting a ballot. In this question, respondents were asked to estimate how much time that it would take for them to go to the polling station and to vote once they arrived. And in this figure, we see that the distribution of the responses, the majority thinks that it takes less than 10 minutes for each of these, and only slightly more than 10% of the respondents think that it will take 20 minutes. So the most frequent response of going to the poll is 10 minutes, and for voting, it is 5 minutes. Now, one of the requirements that people need to fulfill to cast their vote at the polling station is to show some sort of proof of identity and address. Usually this is a driver's license or a government issued card with a photo, a name, and an address. All those who voted were asked in the post-election wave how easy or difficult it was to meet the identification requirement. And I can tell you that a great majority said that it was somewhat easy. Now, the next thing that I want to turn your attention to is we decided to look at some subgroups of the population for whom some aspects of voting are construed to be at least somewhat difficult. Again, we'll look at the same burdens. There's a lot of information here, so I'm not going to cover everything, but I just want to draw your attention to some of the main independent variables that stand out. So as you can see, we've looked at age, we looked at gender, racial minority, if you were born in Canada or not, regions, level of education, employment, whether you're a student or a first-time voter, and so forth. So in these four burdens that I discussed, and I'm just going to show them really quickly to you, what stands out is, for instance, age, right? We distinguish 6 age groups, and we see that being young is the most powerful predictor of facing a major obstacle to voting. And the other interesting finding is that women find it even more difficult to decide whom to vote for. And this may be related to the fact that women are more likely to recognize that they are not well informed. So next, I want to turn your attention to 4 specific groups that we have reasons to believe face greater obstacles. These are Indigenous people, people with disabilities, those who have never voted before, and people who are not in education, employment, or training, which we called NEET. So for each of these groups, we show that whether they're the mean burden is higher than in the rest of the sample, controlling for all the other variables that I just showed you previously, which include age, education, income, and other social demographic characteristics. So again, I want to show you these figures very quickly, and these are exactly the same 4 burdens that we were looking at before. And so here again, the biggest difficulty is felt by individuals who never voted before. We distinguish 3 subgroups. The first consists of those who are too young to vote at the time of the previous federal election, which was in October 2015. They make up 3% of our sample. The second is those who were not Canadian citizens at the time of the previous election, but who acquired citizenship before the 2019 federal election. They represent about 0.2% of the respondents. And finally, the third is made up of those who indicated that they had abstained in all previous elections that they were eligible to vote in. They constitute about 5% of the sample. So the figures that I'm showing you right now show that it is among the group that were eligible to vote for the first time who systematically find it more difficult to vote. And this applies to each burden. It seems that having decided not to participate in a previous election makes one believe that it may not be easy to vote. So we look at the various social demographic characteristics in our study. We find that the most important of all as age. The perceived burden is highest among those aged 18 to 24. We also considered various groups for whom we had reasons to believe that voting could constitute a bigger hurdle. We find that this is the case only for specific subgroups like Indigenous people living on reserves, persons with severe disabilities, and only for some burdens, especially those related to going to the polling station and casting a vote. Finally, it seems that abstaining in all past elections and hence not having experienced the act of voting leads one to assume that voting may not be easy. So we have three recommendations. The first is that we believe that Elections Canada should reiterate that voting is a very easy task. We also believe that there should be more student votes to give young people more experience and early experience with the act of voting. And like most European countries, we think that Canada should make registration automatic, which would make it a bit more easier for people to vote. That's all for me. Thank you for your time.
Great, thanks very much, Semra. There's a lot of really good stuff in there that I'm sure we'll be able to dig into in the Q&A. So thank you. Next we have Kojo Dempti, who is an interdisciplinary scholar practitioner, musician, and decolonial advocate. Born in Ghana, he moved to Hamilton in 2001 to pursue a degree in chemical engineering at McMaster. He holds a Master of Arts in Interdisciplinary Studies from Royal Roads University and is currently working towards another Master Inclusion. Kojo is going to talk today about some of the activities at Engagement Campaign. Kojo?
Yes, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you for inviting HCCI, the Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion, to discuss some of the work that we have been doing here in Hamilton. So I have my slides up. Hopefully everyone can see them. I think, you know, when we're talking about an issue such as voting, we always have to talk about the history of this country. And so I always start my presentations with this picture that depicts, indigenous communities and nations being pushed out by the Canadian state. And so that has an impact on the work that we do. I know that these days, Indigenous, we've been doing land acknowledgements, and those don't go too deep. We recite them and we move on. So I instead share this picture with everyone so that you can get a sense of how this country was built and how it also impacts some of the things we're talking about in terms of people engaging with voting, who does and who doesn't. So. This picture, the credit goes to Dr. Vanessa Watts from McMaster University. So what did HCCI do during the federal election in 2019? We partnered with Democratic Exchange to run the Vote Pop-Up. The Vote Pop-Up is a simple tool to get people to go through the process of voting. So HCCI partnered up with the Hamilton Public Library. Shout outs to the library for partnering with us. We had training sessions with different organizations, and we were, I think I would say we were very prescriptive or intentional with the organizations that we did trainings for. So we're talking about YWCA in Hamilton. We're talking about the Immigrants Working Center. We're talking about organizations that deal with populations that have been marginalized and that have historically not been included in the voting process. So that's what we ended up doing. This is a picture of one of the participants at our training session, and one of the questions that we were asking was, "What matters to you?" And so this is one of the participants saying mental health services. We also had other questions: why vote, what matters, and these are some of the responses that that we got. Representation is a huge topic, and I'm sure the academics will talk about how representation impacts who goes out to vote and also who is elected. I know there was a recent article about the background of current MPs in the House of Commons, and majority of them came from lawyer background, higher class background, and those impact decisions that are also made. So when we talk about representation, we're talking about a wide gamut of things that influence whether people go out to vote. So here is the breakdown of some of the interactions that we had. So we had about 30 representatives from 10 organizations that came out to the training session that Democratic Engagement Exchange had. It's kind of like a train the trainer. They trained us, and then now we go out and do the training out in the community. And then after the training, we had the vote pop up at libraries, at cultural events. We set it up by the street. We did a voter clinic with Canada Elections Canada, and we interacted with over 200 residents, many of whom had never voted before or appreciated the fact that we're going through the process of how long it takes to vote, casting your vote, and all of those things. And we also talked about different things that had nothing to do with voting while people were engaged in the vote pop-up process. And that also builds community trust, which then ensures that when we're talking about the importance of people to vote, they've heard it before, they trust what we are saying, and we can lend support. And I had to end with my picture, why vote? To change the system. And when we say change the system, we're talking about historical implications of voting. My colleague Semra talked about it. When we are talking about voting, folks with disabilities, visible and invisible disabilities, don't go to the polling station. Why? If they're using mobility services and we don't have an infrastructure to get them to the polling station, then people are not going to vote. We had a session where we spoke to women at a women's shelter. And if we are not sharing that information with them, obviously they are not going to vote because they are dealing with current issues in their life. So when we talk about voting, we really have to expand and provide an infrastructure aside from just saying, hey, this is the information, everybody figure it out for yourself and go and vote. We really have to start investing in infrastructure that ensures that everybody goes out and votes, regardless of where they're from, whether they have a job, whether they're a new Canadian, whether this is the first time they're doing it, whether they're in university, whatever their background might be. So a typical example is we know that in municipal elections, voter turnout is abysmal. We're talking about anywhere between 30 to 35%. So why is it that we don't ensure that we have public transit that allows for everyone to go to the polling station? Why don't we do it over a weekend period where people are not working? Because not everybody gets the opportunity to take a day off, to go out and vote, to spend the time. So I think these are the things that we need to start talking about when we want to increase voter turnout and we want to build an inclusive democracy. Because if we're not building that infrastructure, then our democracy is definitely not inclusive. And I'll end by quoting the great John Beebe, who says that democracy needs to be practiced after voting, right? Democracy is not just casting the vote. After you cast the vote, between that 4-year period or whatever it might be, we still have to be engaged in the process to get people to say, hey, look, this is why I need to go out and vote. This is why it's important for me to go out and vote. So I think we need to definitely build an infrastructure to ensure that anybody can go out to vote regardless of where they are from or what they might be facing in their current status and life. So that's it. And I hope to answer more questions.
Thanks, Kojo. I appreciate you talking about municipal elections. That's an interest of mine. I live in a city where we had turnout of 27.4% in the most recent election. So I hear you on that one. For our third and final speaker, we have Doha Soliman, who serves on the board and as program director of the Canadian Muslim Vote, which is a charitable organization centered around education, empowerment, and engagement of the Muslim community. Soliman has completed an economics and political science degree at the U of T.
I don't know about the rest of you, but I think got a freeze from Mike, so I'm going to jump in here and hopefully we can turn it right over to Doha to start your presentation.
Okay, sounds good. Hi, everyone. I'm Doha Soliman. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for including me. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, John, Professor McGregor, and then Semra Sevi and Kojo. It's been so nice to hear you all speak. And we have a lot of, I feel like we're going to be reiterating a lot of the same points. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the Canadian Muslim Vote, what we do. I'm going to go over the last election campaign we had, and I'm going to discuss some of the challenges we face with regards to inclusion. So can everybody see my screen okay? Give me a thumbs up. Yeah, we're good? Okay. So the Canadian Muslim Vote is a grassroots national charitable organization. We are nonpartisan. We were founded in 2015, and our key values are education and empowerment. Our objective is to increase the civic engagement of Canadian Muslims through community outreach and education. So the way we structured the organization in order to be nonpartisan is everybody who's affiliated with the organization, the board, the employees, volunteers, donors, even donors, they fall on all ends of the political spectrum. And this allows us to have checks and balances and keep each other in check. So if somebody is posting something or doing something that looks like it's a little bit partisan, we will be sure to keep each other in check. And it just try to eliminate our individual biases so that as an organization, we can be reflective of what's going on in the political sphere. So we think there's a very, very important role for nonprofits that can play a large role in mobilizing marginalized communities. So as Semra and Kojo both spoke about, so Indigenous groups, young voters, students, marginalized communities, recent immigrants, or people who just recently obtained their citizenship, a lot of them may not be contacted directly by different government bodies and political organizations because they're not on the list, they've never interacted with them. And for the same, in the same way, marginalized groups may feel very uncomfortable or intimidated to reach out to those groups or to their MPs or their MPPs or even different political parties. So even if they are interested in politics, they may feel like it's overwhelming, they're not qualified to do so. So we feel that nonprofit organizations, regardless of what their focus is, so CCMB happens to be focused on voter turnout, but regardless of what any nonprofit organization's focus should be, they should all play a large role in communicating between marginalized groups and different political parties and government bodies. You could be thinking about any mandate that any nonprofit has, and the education component of encouraging people to vote and encouraging people to reach out to their MPs will actually give everybody a voice all around. And it will help them if they are an advocacy group. So let's go over the 2019 federal election. So our three primary objectives were to educate the Canadian Muslim population on their civic and democratic rights, as well as the importance of voting. That's always going to be our mandate. That's always what we're working on. To speak to the greatest number of Canadian Muslims in each of the 45 swingable ridings within 8 target regions: Brampton, Mississauga, Milton, Montreal, Northwest, Southeast, Ottawa, Gatineau, Toronto East, Toronto West, and York. And also to target individuals using all forms of media, whether it's conventional print, TV, and radio, or non-conventional such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Or inclusivity. So we tried to be as inclusive as possible. We tried to realize that a large component of our current database is very homogeneous. So we wanted to try to reach more people, both in geographically throughout all of Canada, as well as different demographics, age group, ethnicities. So we wanted to basically extend our reach. So we took on several new programs that we felt would help us reach a wider audience. The first one was to widen our reach within the young Muslim population. We introduced a vote on Canvas collaboration with Muslim student associations. So we reached out to a whole bunch of different universities. We spoke with their MSAs, and we talked to them about the work we're doing, and we collaborated that way so that they would be able to reach their students and people who had never voted before. And as Semra said, that was actually a really big gap for people. They felt like it wouldn't be easy to vote for the first time or to register to vote. So that we felt that would be important to bring that on. Another one is to overcome inclusivity barriers. We created campaign kits. So instead of trying to widen our gap and to try to reach more people through social media or through actually going to different communities and developing an entirely new relationship, we figured, why not give it to the leaders in individual communities where they're already trusted, where people are already listening to them. And that's where campaign kits come in. I'll show you guys the video if we have time at the end. So basically the campaign kit, people request it, they get a banner, they get a t-shirt, they get all types of information, little pamphlets about voting, and we would send it out all throughout Canada. We actually had requests for 130 different campaign kits, and those were 130 individual leaders doing the work for us and trying to inform people on what's going on in the political spectrum. And then finally develop tools to support community organizers. So, or community organizers were having any issues with regards to voting, trying to understand what's happening with the election, we tried to develop different tools and different resources for them. Okay, so after this was all said and done, we tried to evaluate what we did. We partnered with over 130 different institutions. We reached 4.7 million touch points within the community and have been present at hundreds of events throughout the Get Out to Vote campaign. Throughout the duration of the campaign, we hit 2.1 million impressions on social media. And some of that was through the influencer campaign, where we reached out to a lot of Muslim influencers who had high following on their social media. And we asked them to tell us why they're voting. And we just did a little banner and they would post it, and then they would have people engaging with them, talking about it. And it just got the conversation going, which is what we wanted. We knocked on several thousand doors. We made 11,000 live phone calls. We had an active presence of coordinators and volunteers in 8 different provinces. And we grew our database, our online database, by 121%. So, and the most impressive part, I think, was the campaign kits. So we had 135 of those go out. And I feel like that's so much more important than just social media alone, because these are people that have built relationships and they trust each other and they trust their leaders. And if you're even starting that conversation, that's where we want everybody to be. One of the main things we realized from doing our evaluation of our federal campaign is that in order to maximize outreach, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have to tap into existing organizations and existing commitments and collaborations within different communities and just partner with them and collaborate with them as opposed to trying to start our own new network of people. So the next step is, that was our in-house assessment of how we did. That was based on our staff, our executive director, and all the different people involved in TCMP. But we also wanted to get a more unbiased opinion of what the community thought of what we're doing. So we actually contracted an independent consultant who went on and spoke with different community leaders, different members of the Muslim community, and tried to reach as wide of a demographic as possible to understand what we were doing and what gaps we were missing. So some of the feedback was very positive. Some people said that seeing us interview all four major political parties was something that they appreciated. It made us a trusted source of information. There was a lot of objectivity and very little individual bias, which is what we aim to do. Also, a lot of people were saying that they liked the way we simplified some of the information. It was bite-sized information. They weren't interested in going to different websites and watching all these different debates. They actually just kind of wanted a touch point of like, okay, what's going on with this person, right? So some people don't want to dedicate all day reading all the different platforms. So that was some of the positive feedback we received. And then some people said that we need to engage our volunteers for target outreach. We have very diverse volunteers. However, some people were saying that we only represented a small portion of the Muslim population, that we were missing a lot of age groups, we were missing some women, we were missing different components. So this is something that we would have to work on and try to have a greater geographical scope, different neighborhoods, different demographics, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, languages. So future objectives, we want to develop governing structures for strong recruitment process. The more diverse our board is, our staff are, our volunteers are, the better representation we'll have of the entire Muslim community. We also want to do targeted outreach in underrepresented communities based on the consultant report we had, and tap into grassroots efforts. A lot of communities within Canada of the Muslim population are actually very easy to mobilize because they have, they might not be officially structured as organizations, but they're actually very, very strong communities. And we would like to tap into that. So right now what we've done is we've only tapped into organizations that were recognized, whether it was mosques, community centers, schools, MSAs, or nonprofits. But what we need to do is actually just recognize that there's a group of 50 people who are very active and they work together and they're ready to mobilize. So these are the people we need to start tapping into, a little bit of an official type groups. And always focus more on women. Can't go wrong with that. Let me just slide here.
You wrapping? I want to give us time to get to the Q&A here.
Okay, so yeah, I'm just wrapping up with basically what John said, Kojo said, and what Obama said. And it's basically, you need to engage all day, every day. You need to be mobilizing all the time. This is not something you do where you vote every 4 years, but you actually need to be as well informed as possible because you need to understand the political world holistically to know what decisions to make for yourself and your family. And yeah, that's it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Yeah, so as anticipated, a lot to work with there. We only have, in our brief session here, we only have a few minutes to dive into some really important issues. But a couple of key takeaways, one being that we're very fortunate that in Canada, voting is easy. and we don't face the kind of institutional voter suppression that other places in the world face. And so part of our job as organizations, and we heard people talking about, is making that clear to people who haven't participated before. And I know, Semra, in some of your research, you showed that people actually, the experience of voting is actually easier than what they anticipated, reporting afterwards. And I know, Kojo, I've heard from you that, it was really, that you've heard the same thing from people you work for, like after they voted, there's, oh, that was easier than we thought it might be. And that's the purpose of the vote pop-up sessions, is to remind people how easy it is. But what's really interesting, I think, in what we're combining, the sort of what we hear from the research from Semra, and that and I want to hear from Doha and Kojo about, is that the bigger barrier is how to decide who to vote for. I'm a newish Canadian now, and I still don't really have a clear understanding of the difference between the liberals and the conservatives, and like what's their position, and then you go to BC and it's a totally different system, and then you have this whole thing, Bloc Quebec. I don't even understand. Fortunately, I don't live in Quebec, but it's complicated if you're new to the system. And so what I'd love to hear in the little bit of time we have remaining is from Doha and Kojo, some of the steps you took to help people get over that higher hurdle of not just, oh, I want to vote, but who should I vote for? When people said to you, who should I vote for? What did you say? How did you respond to that? Because I know you're conducting nonpartisan engagement activities. But that's a really important, and maybe the most important decision people have to make, is not just to vote, but actually to make a well-informed decision. And how did you deal with that? And then we'll go to Q&A from you, the attendees here. So please put those up and send those through. So Doha or Kojo, if you want to, Doha, do you want to jump in on that? Because I know you interviewed all the party leaders. You maybe want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it's interesting, when I set up one booth personally at the Palestine House to talk to people about, please register to vote, make sure you're voting, and everybody just ran. It was actually all friends of my dad, and they all came up to me and they said, okay, so tell me who to vote for. I trust you. I said, I can't do that, but I can give you resources that are very simplified if you're not interested in reading all about it. Like we actually have like little charts of where they stand on different issues, and you could actually click on them and get more information if there's something you were interested in learning about. But we regularly get this, please just tell me, we trust you. Or shouldn't all Muslims be voting for this one person? And I said, absolutely not. It depends on your personal needs and what your views are. So we try to refrain as much as possible from answering that. We just say it doesn't matter who you vote for as long as you vote, but it does matter to you. So please try to do your due diligence. And again, the bite-sized information. A lot of people don't want to spend the time and effort.
And so you created little info cards about various issues, and then you interviewed. Yeah. And are those available on your website?
Maybe not on the website. Some of it is, some of it is not, but I can actually get access to that. And you know what? Maybe we should put it on. That's a great idea. Social media.
Right.
We're very active on our social media, so everything is usually on our Instagram page. And we also have little clips based on the surveys we conducted, asking Muslims what their areas of interest are. We created little edited clips of what the different candidates said about those issues. Also on our Instagram.
Right. So others who might be interested in that can follow up with you on getting that.
Absolutely.
Kojo.
Yeah, so quickly, so what we ended up doing was we created a one-pager of how, on one side, it had how people could register, where they could, what ID they needed to go to the poll. So we had all that information there. Shout outs to Elections Canada and John for that information. So we had that there. And then on the other side, we had a list of all the ridings. Because another thing is, we were talking to folks, and they didn't know which riding they were in. So we had a list of all the ridings and all the folks from different parties, independent, what have you. We made sure that we had a list of all of them. I think our first iteration, we missed out an independent person, and so we had to change it. So that's how we kind of bridged that gap to say, hey, look, this is everybody that's running. These are the ridings, and this is how you sign up to vote. And then that created some of the further discussion needed. But yeah, we nonpartisan, we stayed away from telling people who to vote, what the issues are. We stayed away from that.
Yeah. So we have a great question from Nicholas, and about, which is something we hear across the board, that people say, well, okay, you're telling me to vote, but it doesn't matter. They say they feel like their voice isn't being heard, and that politicians don't care about them because they don't have any sway. And as I'm sure we have all experienced, we probably have all felt that at some point, and certainly know people who feel that. Semra, with your research, were you able to tease out at all or look at, for folks who said they weren't participating, what some of the reasons why they weren't participating?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I think the keynote talk by Andre Blay in a few days, or is it next week?
Yeah, next week.
We'll cover this in more detail, but I could say that what we find in the literature and what we are able to also see in the data set that we have is that individuals who are motivated to vote, these are people who are interested, who care, who feel a sense of civic duty, are more likely to vote and are more likely to make a decision on who to vote for. And all these burdens are not really burdens for them. So it comes down to individuals who are less interested and less motivated, who tend to not vote in the end. So it's a matter of studying those individuals more, and they're harder to capture in survey data because they don't answer surveys. So it's really hard to conclusively say this is the solution to that. More research needs to be done with them, essentially.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, is that it's hard to know what the underlying motivation or lack of motivation is for folks, and to unpack that. But yeah, and I think Doha, I mean, one of the things that I've been very fortunate working with you and the team at the Canadian Muslim Vote for years now, and really seen how you have impacted the power and the voice of the Muslim community in Canada through the work. So, I mean, maybe you can just share a little bit of that experience, because ultimately, I think it gets back to what Kojo said at the end, is why are we involved in this? Well, it's not just because, voting is some nice activity, but voting is a source of power that lets us build the future that we want. And so if that, in fact, if that goal of building power is not true, if the politicians will continue to ignore us, then, let's not pretend here. But I think the Canadian Muslim Vote has done an extraordinary job of actually building power. And can you talk to us a little bit about how you've done that and what that looks like and how that's worked for the community?
That's a great question, John. Thank you for bringing that up. And you know what? There's always going to be some individuals who do believe that there's no need to vote. It doesn't matter. But I think there's strength in numbers, and that's what we're trying to show. We actually, not me myself, but some great members on our team actually developed basically what the swing ridings were, which is there's more Muslims in that population within a riding than there is for the margin of victory. And people actually starting to realize that if people are voting, you really do have a voice. And it's not just one person voting, it's collectively we have a voice, right? And I think people started seeing that more and more. There's people who were very happy to see this from the very get-go. They were very excited about this organization and they believed in the mandate. And I feel like a lot of people actually changed their minds over time as they did start seeing that two-way interaction with politicians. They used to feel that politicians were completely inaccessible. And then they realized that all the party leaders were at our dinner last year. You know, the prime minister was there, Andrew Scheer was there, Jagmeet Singh were there, and so many different politicians from all levels of government, from municipal, provincial, and federal. So they started seeing that, you know what, maybe if we do start trying to express how we feel, whether through voting or donating our time or resources or whatever way to civically engage, you actually will be heard. And I think that's actually what changed a lot of people's minds about the political process.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I think I've been very fortunate. You've invited me to the e-dinners, and I've loved being there and seeing those rooms full of people, engaging from the community, engaging, but also our leaders there, asking for your support. And I think that's a sign of political power that I found very impressive. Kojo, at the local level, you've done amazing work in the Hamilton. Maybe for those of us who don't know that as much about Hamilton, we have a national audience here. You could give us a little bit of a context of the work you're doing in Hamilton and how the civic engagement and the voter engagement work supports your broader efforts to deal with racism and to deal with other challenges you face there, and how that's connected. And to what degree have you felt like you've been able to build any political power for the communities you work with there through this work?
Yeah, so I think in the work that we do, whether it's doing vote pop-ups or addressing racism or doing civic engagement, our core question is what matters to you, right? And I think that ties into the question that one of the participants asked: why is it that people are not involved? I think if you ask people what matters to you, and then when they respond, and you connect that to a level of government that needs to respond, then now you are engaging in a process to hold elected officials accountable, right? Because what we also found out that was people don't necessarily understand the different levels of government and what they are responsible for, right? So Mike will probably have more knowledge on this. Municipal government, they have access or they respond to so many services, but most people think it's the province and the feds that deal with those issues, right? So if we are able, that's why civic engagement is important. If you are able to let people know that, hey, if you want your garbage picked up twice a week, you need to talk to your counselor, right? Not your MPP, right? If you want your educational system changed, you need to talk to your MPP, not your counselor, right? So I think once you ask people what matters to them, and then you are able to link that to the specific level of government, once they start making that connection, that helps with people being engaged, and now they have to hold elected officials accountable. And that's something that I think in Hamilton we've done very well in terms of holding elected officials accountable. It gets us into trouble sometimes, but we live in an inclusive democracy, so we have to cause some trouble. Not all the time, but sometimes.
I think there's someone who spoke about getting yourself in good trouble. I think isn't that Ruth Bader Ginsburg? Yeah.
Don't do it. Don't do it.
Yeah. But Kojo, I'm gonna push you a little bit here though, because it's one thing to say to somebody, okay, here's the level of government, and if you want to deal with this, and make sure you're talking to the right counselor. But for me as an individual, going to my elected official or my MP, you know, okay, I go to the right person, but you know, maybe they pay attention to me, maybe they don't. And you know, I think Doha spoke to something very powerful. You know, and this is something that we talk about all the time. You know, I don't pretend when somebody says, "Oh, my vote doesn't matter." You know, I say something very controversial. I say, "You're right. Your vote doesn't matter, but our vote matters because as the individual, we don't necessarily, you know, going to make the one difference. My vote's not going to change the, you know, end climate change or, you know, but if we do, when we do it together collectively. And so I think if you want, can you talk a little bit about like the good trouble you're causing and how you work collectively? Because one thing you mentioned was the building of the trust in the community, and particularly for people who have faced marginalization and who have in fact had their trust betrayed. They're not wrong. I mean, they have been lied to. They have been, you know, betrayed in situations. How do you rebuild that trust and create power? And you know, how are you doing that in Hamilton?
Well, I'll give you one example. There's a LGBTQ youth group called Spectrum here in Hamilton. During the municipal election in 2018, their issues have not been addressed for years, right? Years. And there's so many issues that they are facing that, you know, municipal, provincial, and federal haven't addressed. So what the group did was they had they created a short document asking all the candidates to sign on to this document to address some of their concerns. So now that they had the attention of the candidates, right, that meant that whichever candidate won the election, now they were bound to addressing some of those issues. So I think that's the connection that I mean by if you are able to say, hey, who do we who is responsible for addressing these issues, right? Then you build a coalition around the issues that you are concerned about. So we supported their work. There's Akon Hamilton supported their work, right? The YWCA supported their work, and that's the coalition building that we need to get over the hump. When Semra talked about the different socio-economic differences that hold people back, coalition building allows for us to have that multi-layered approach so that we are not in the silos, but we are overlapping and we are understanding how my issues are connected to another person's issues, and we are able to build that collective power to make the change that we want to see.
Yeah. So if you have questions, please put them up through the Q&A. And Taylor, if there are questions coming through, please pass them through to us. But I wanted to turn it over to Mike for some follow-up here.
Yeah, hopefully I don't cut out this time. Sorry, guys. I just wanted to touch upon something Kojo said and then throw a question out. This idea of people don't know what their governments are responsible for. That's a real problem, right? There's a fellow by the name of Fred Cutler out at UBC who's written a bit on this with respect to federal and provincial kind of attributions of responsibility. If you don't know who's responsible for what, you don't know when you need to vote, you don't know who to hold responsible, right? If you don't like something, who do you blame? This is a problem not only at the federal and provincial levels, it's a problem locally. As Kojo mentioned, technically our municipalities are creatures of the province, but they do have a lot of things they're responsible for and have jurisdiction for, and they can be super complicated. So I live in the Peel region. We also have a regional government. So is the region responsible for my garbage or the local government, right? It's a very, very complicated thing. Places like Montreal, where Semra is, you have the boroughs. I won't try to pronounce it in French, I'll butcher it. But you have the kind of like sub-municipal governments. Who do you blame or credit for what? When do you need to vote or not vote? It's super important stuff. So when you're educating, I think Kojo, you hit the nail on the head. That's something you need to talk about. So I actually have a question for the three presenters, and I'm looking forward to the reports that we're producing. And John's going to have these on the web page, where one of the things we want to do out of this speaker series, the Canadian Vote Summit, is figure out what messages you have coming from your point of view as either an academic or practitioner, what messages you have for people in the other silos. So Semra, what do you want people who are practitioners to know or think about, and Doha and Kojo, maybe what do you want people like Semra and myself to think about, maybe study, you know, because we're coming from very different perspectives, and I think it's super valuable and important to have this conversation. So I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll go first. Well, first, it's to all the nonprofits out there, regardless of what your mandate is, get people informed on the importance of voting. And as an organization, they would have to be very well versed in who would handle the specific issue that you're dealing with. So which level of government, whether it's regional, municipal, provincial, federal. And then to the academics, I would love to see some research on the role that nonprofits play in mobilizing communities from a scientific perspective. Kojo, Semra?
Okay. Okay. Go ahead, Semra.
No, please go ahead. I'll go last.
Okay. All right. You know, for me, I think that if we could find a way to turn the research into action, right? The Semra's presentation was, we know this, and our challenge is how do we then now, you know, start addressing these issues, because these things have been happening over and over and over and over. Michael, you know, women and women of color aren't fully represented in government, right? So what are the things that we can do? What kind of infrastructure can be done to ensure that we start making that change, and we don't keep talking about it? Because after a while, you know, we don't want people to be disillusioned. We want to see the actual change. So turning research into resources to get the action items done.
Okay, I just want to touch on 2 points that were mentioned. I think Kojo mentioned it repeatedly a few times, which is on representation. Specifically, he just said that having more women in parliament, and also previously he touched on different occupations, like there's a lot of lawyers in parliament, for instance. It's not in this research, but in other research that I've conducted, I do show and find that when women do run, they are more likely to be elected, just as likely to be elected as men are. So the problem isn't that, you know, that voters are punishing them. The problem is something a little bit more deeper. It's at the level of deciding whether or not they can vote, and this might be related to resources, or it may be related to role models. But it's certainly not that voters are not voting for women, or they're voting for women in fewer numbers than they are for men. This is also true for occupations. So we know that in the Canadian Parliament, for example, we know that lawyers have dominated for a very long time. So that's a good point. But in other research that I've done, looking at the trajectory of lawyers and other occupations over time, in the Canadian Parliament specifically, I do show that lawyers don't do just like better today than they did like in 1867 or earlier in earlier parliaments. They do. They still have a little bit of a boost, but it's very small. So we do see that other people who run with other occupations are also, you know, able to get elected. if they run. So I think that the issue is a little bit more at a personal level, and it's at a more individual level, and that needs to be tackled a little bit more. I think this is where NGOs come into place. Like in the United States, there are think tanks and NGOs that help, for instance, women who want to run in a very resourceful way, in a way that I don't really see in Canada. And I think those are sort of like lessons that we can borrow from other places and bring to Canada. And this is where I think the role of NGOs, think tanks are very important, because they also show researchers gaps in which they can do research that would not otherwise be able to be done at a NGO or think tank level. On the other hand, I mentioned that some of these groups that are not motivated to vote are also the same groups that don't respond to surveys, or they do, but in lower numbers. And I think this is a crucial area where think tanks and NGOs can come into place, because they can reach these individuals in a more systematic way than researchers can. So that's all.
So John's away just for a second. So there's lots in there. One thing I want to ask you to all build upon is this idea of representativeness. I think it's a really important topic. And I think when you do outreach, it's not just important to look to voters, but also maybe candidate recruitment. I think this is a super important thing if you want to have legislatures which are representative. We know that the federal parliament is not representative. In fact, the only level of government where women are not underrepresented is at school boards, right? And so I'll build upon this idea of gender a bit, but I mean, some of these ideas apply to race as well, right? As far as gender is concerned, we know that Semra's right that women don't tend to be discriminated against on the ballot box, right? We don't have gender affinity effects. That is, women are not really more likely to vote for women, and that's not the same for race. But I always think about it as it's not really a demand issue, at least for gender, right? It's not that voters have different demand for men and women, but it's more of a supply issue. So I'm wondering if, as kind of a next step, if any of you have thought of, is it possible to go out there and recruit more people to run, right? So that is, are you talking to potential candidates ever when you're running these events, or are you just talking to voters? Because I think both sides are important.
So yeah, point well taken. And the HCCI, we have a program called the Hamilton Civic Leadership Program. That is a 2-year program that talks about these things. And our hope is that the participants will someday think about running. And the program is geared towards Black, Indigenous, and other racialized youth, ranging from 16 to 25. So our process around that program was also addressing the issue about youth participation in different forms of civic engagement. So that's something that HCCI is doing. Semra talked about the work that's being done in the States. I think of the group Just Democrats that supported AOC and other racialized women in the upcoming election. In Canada, I would say this: I think it's difficult to do work like that because there are hints of political partisanship in that type of work. Even if you were to do it at the municipal level, there's always discussions around progressives and conservatives. And anyways, I don't want to get in trouble here, but I think that's also some of the issues that NGOs face, right? Even when we did the vote pop-up, we had to explicitly state that we were non-partisan because people were thinking that we were leaning towards some party, right? So if you add that the added element of trying to recruit people to run for council or provincial parliament or House of Commons, that then adds that political nature to it, that then can affect your charitable status and what have you. So those are kind of my thoughts.
Doha, do you want to add something? I know you've done work around leadership development and getting young people in sort of to the pipeline of working either in public service or for the parties.
Yeah, definitely. We did have, we've been focusing a lot over the last few years on developing the internship program, and much power to you, John. Our very first cohort was entirely run out of your offices. So thank you for that. I do think it's important to give people the tools and resources to get them started in that. And then whether they do go into the partisanship or not, whether they decide to stay with non-government organizations or nonprofits versus actually going into the partisan world and joining a political party and running, that's something that would be up to them after they go through the initial program. And that's actually some things that we have been looking to develop, is to give people real training to be able to make those decisions. So especially starting with younger people who are just now starting to get into politics, I feel like that would be a really great place to start, is to give them the training on how to run a campaign, even if it's like a partisan campaign, and just going from there.
So we just have a couple of minutes remaining here, and I want to make sure we can check with Kojo and Doha. I assume that we obviously both have websites that people can check out, and if we can share those, in the feed loop, the Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion and the Canadian Muslim Vote. I think we can also we should be able to. And then, Semra, I know your work is part of the Consortium on Electoral Democracy and the studies that you're working on. And I know some of that data sets even are available publicly. Is that right? Yeah. So for those folks who are like me, a kind of a bit of data nerds, you can dig down into the data and explore that for yourself. But I think we've just begun a conversation, and I actually honestly think that there's a lot of great opportunity here in Canada to build on this work. And I know at the Democratic Engagement Exchange, that's our core mission, is to help support and build on and incubate and then champion the kind of work that we're seeing. But as Doha said, this has got to be a team effort. We all have to be involved. We all have different roles to play depending on where we sit, the kind of organizations we're involved in. But I think we can take some inspiration and learn from the folks here. And we have to, and from the data and the research that Semra has done, which really helps clarify, that, we have to first, demystify the voting process, because in fact, it is easy. And for those who don't recognize that yet, to help them understand that. And then B, to make sure we have materials and programs to help people make informed decisions is really important. And that's maybe the bigger and more challenging barrier because of, the partisanship that can be associated with that and understanding that. So please stay connected. I want to thank everyone who's joined us here today. I want to invite you to come back next week during the Democracy Exchange, and on our website at engagedemocracy.ca, you can register for our session next week. And we are going to close, as I said at the beginning, with the CEO of Elections Canada and Andre Blais sharing some of their insights. And then we're going to have a little party afterwards that evening. So we're going to have a much more informal time to get to meet people who've been here, connect with other people you may not have met. These online sessions are good, but they're not as fun as being able to hang out and have coffee or beverages or whatever your choice is and really meet people. And we're going to try to do a little of that next week. So join us for that. Stay in touch. Join our mailing list to be updated on all of these activities. and feel free to reach out to us because I think all of us are always looking for to learn about people doing interesting work in this space. There's plenty of work to do, and I'm really grateful for everybody to being here today. So I think with that, we have to wrap here. Mike, any last word? All right. So thanks for everybody. I'm going to ask our panelists to stay on here for a second, but I think we can stay on and then we can close out the session.